all the clamps are off. All the ribs are solid. All I'm going to do now is take a little hand plane here and trim off the tops of these just to get the meat off, and then I'll actually sand the rest to get it down to the right levels. And then we have to do the lining, which should be interesting because normally I would use buckeye or some other light wood, but this yellow cedar bent so easily and nicely. I'm gonna try it first in the yellow cedar before trying anything else. So I'll sit here for a little while and take off the high spots and get it down close to my blocks, and then we will sand it all down. Man, this stuff smells so good. All right, so here we are with our rib structure. All the ribs are bent, the corners are clipped, not fully profiled, but just the majority of the meat off. You saw me hand plane the tops of these ribs off to get them nice and level, relatively. But to get into the final dimensions of the blocks and where I need to be for my measurements, I'm using a piece of sandpaper mounted to some float glass. And what I can do here is I'll hold this down evenly and lightly sand to make sure I have no high spots on these ribs before I put in the lining. Once I put in the lining, I'll do the final leveling, but this is just a measure to get everything flat and even so that I don't have any lining sticking up in weird places. So I'll sit here for a while, sand this, and then we can start cutting and bending our lining. All right, I got it sanded down to where I have just over 30 millimeters up top. I'm gonna shrink that down, just over 32 in the back. We'll shrink that down, obviously, over the end. But I'm going to cut out the notches here in the corners of my corner blocks. And these little notches will accept the lining to keep it from springing out. It's not necessary to put them in these corners because if the lining wants to spring out, it has nowhere to go. Right, so it's just superfluous to put those here. So I'll line that, but I have to cut out these notches, like I said, for that lining to tuck in so it doesn't want to pop out in any way. So I'll have to do that 8 times, on 4 on each side. But yeah, we're getting there. So let me cut these out, and then we'll cut some lining. Now, I used to do this with a power tool and a few other things, but I pre-cut some lines in here before I glued up my walls, so it's easier to cut this out. And I just have a chisel that I've made out of an X-Acto blade. That's the right width that I need. And so I just pared down and in to get that done. So I'll zoom in and show what it looks like. So you can see right here, All right, let's talk about our lining here for a second. Normally I would use buckeye. That's my favorite wood to use for this lining. Some people use spruce and whatever else is, all sorts of stuff. But I like the buckeye. It's super soft, super lightweight, but pretty resilient. So it takes a decent curve and it glues really, really well. So that's what I use it for. And I usually cut long sticks of it like this. If you've seen in the Tally-Ho fiddle making series, you saw me make this from scratch. And so I make a bunch of these pieces at a time. But trying to keep everything in here from the local places, even the lining, I think is kind of cool. So I had a choice. I could use some hemlock, but I had quite a bit of this yellow cedar left over from making the ribs. And so I had the pith, nope, not pith, but the end of this board, you can see right here, this was part of this yellow cedar board that these came out of the ribs. And so I had to kind of avoid some knots. There's some little knots in here. So I had to find part of the board where there was no knots, and if there were, I had to cut them out. But anyways, out of this piece, I got my little lining stock. So all these little pieces are gonna be shaped and then bent into place. So how I shape them is just with a block plane, and I take the corner off down to a bevel, and then once that's there, I'll sand it lightly and soak them in water in order to steam bend them into place, basically. So first, let's show you how I use a hand plane, because I use it a little differently than most people would use it for this purpose. So I'm a pretty big advocate of traditional hand planes, whether they're Western style like this, or Japanese style kanas, or anything like that, or specialty kind of weird planes. This is a standard Stanley Bailey number 4 smoothing plane. And so this is the right size for what you're gonna see me do in a second. But you can use them in all sorts of ways in all sorts of arenas. So you can use them in specialty making for like barrels, you can use them in tool making, or handle making, or instrument making. I mean, anyways, they're infinite in terms of their possibilities and purposes. So this is the way I use this though. I actually keep the tool still and I can move the work. So I like a number 4 in this circumstance. I use it kind of like an old traditional joiner. I have it upside down on my vise with the edge still sticking up, so I'm not going to bottom out anywhere. My fingers are safe. I'm not trying to run something over something very flexible. But that Stanley numbers 4 is nice because in the center of my vise I keep the iron, and I can still reach the adjustment knob down here if I need to take a lighter pass. So I can take a piece like this and now take a cut like that. The shaving just came out the top and bottom, just split. But I can go like this, and all I'm going to do is take a few passes and get this down to an angle. All right, so all the shavings are dropping here on my floor, and right now I've just got a chamfer on there, but I will profile all of these until they are slightly round, right, to take off the weight and make it a little easier to bend. So I'll sit here, put on some good music, and get to it. And I'll show you when they're all done. See my little profile right there. I've got them smoothed and round over, scraped them all nice and clean. So all these little linings are ready to soak in some water, and then I'll bend them with some heat and fit them in place. All right, so you'll see this lovely jar in some of these shots. This is what I soak all of my linings in and ribs. I made this years ago as a way to soak banjo skins, because you have to curl them up and they take up a lot of space. So the lid here actually has a sliding, you can't see it because of my sweatshirt, there you go, has a sliding weight, so that when you put the lid on, the weight slides down and holds the banjo skin underwater. So it works very the same way with all the linings. So all my linings will go in here, and we'll set that right there, keep them down from floating around. So after these soak for about 10 to 15 minutes, I'll be pulling them out and starting to bend them. So I'm using a Stanley number 7 here as a joiner to flatten the boards that will become the top. So I've ripped them all in half. So now it's time just to true up the insides from the saw marks and the outsides from the original condition of the board. You'll see some things happening really fast that you may not be aware of. So I'm going to talk you through just a couple things so that people don't get mad at me in this world of hand tool woodworking. Some people get really mad when you make a pass and then you drag the plane back over it thinking it dulls your iron or messes up something. What I do, I'll cut one this way and you'll see me barely lift the heel and drag it over the toe. I do not do this. To me, that's a waste of energy. So you'll see me lift the toe back and set it down. Now, also, I got one side just to make sure it's flat because I know this is the problem side. So I'm going to take off the majority from the inside. Gosh, this stuff is so pretty. So I can show you here. You can see where the plane's hitting here, there, and at the top, right? So I have to get down to where these are gone. But mainly I'm trying to get a reference surface so that I can joint the edges for glue up. So I don't need this to be super dead flat right now because I'm going to carve it and shape it. But I do need one side to sit flat so that when I glue it, I can make sure everything is trimmed up nicely. So we'll get them ready to go. So I'm going to hand plane and just surface clean up the inside of my saw marks. Now also, this woodworking bench used to be a bowling alley. That's what this big hole is where you can tighten the bolt that goes through it. I'm actually getting close to having to do something about this top. I've resurfaced it a few times over the last 20 years, and so it's gone down slightly. But yeah, so these are dog holes, for those that don't know, and I have bench dogs in here that clamp to the other side to hold the board from going anywhere, and I don't hit any clamps while I'm planing. So I have this set up over on this Moravian workbench, but it's always full of stuff, and it's never good for filming because it goes against the wall and you wouldn't see what I'm doing here. So we'll get this guy cleaned all up, flattened up so we can joint the edges, and we'll be off to the races. All right, so there is the inside of our top. The only reason you're seeing these two differences, if you see them, is the actual age of the board. But I think that'll probably go away on the front. This is just the exterior patina still soaked in a little bit. I don't want to take off as much as I can. I just want to take off just enough. So I did a pass with my jointer to flatten everything, and then a final pass with my smoothing plane to get complete shavings. And so we'll be ready to go. So now we get to actually see the shape of our violin. So there's our lining tightly tucked in place. I'll get all the other ones done and then we'll glue them in. If you've tailored the lining correctly, you don't need a lot of pressure to hold it in place. These clothespins that I've altered by lining the insides of the cork do the trick. It just takes a little bit of pressure to hold it in place while the glue sets and dries. Let's take a second and appreciate that bottom joint that's just going to disappear. Looking good.